Welcome everyone to our third module of the Design Educators Typography Intensive. I'm Gloria Kondrup and I'm the Executive Director of the HMCT. And this intensive continues the legacy of ArtCenter Professor Leah Hoffmitz Milken, who for 3 days was a dedicated educator and she had a profound dedication to teaching and her desire to give back to her students and fellow educators. She was intensely interested in the effects of technology and changing cultural influences on design of letterforms, typography, and their use in graphic design and visual communication. I want to give a wonderful shout out to Google, our partner in this. Without them, we wouldn't be doing this. Welcome, Jason Pamental. I love you call yourself a tinkerer. He's a tinkerer, but he's a designer, a strategist, and an expert in web typography. And he writes and works with teams and brand owners on how to set type better on digital platforms. Greg Lindy is the founder and creative director of Lux Typographic Design, which I think you launched in 2009. It is a Los Angeles studio based, and he works in innovative type and brand. And in addition, Greg is a professor at ArtCenter College of Design, and he teaches digital font design. So I am going to disappear, maybe. I will turn it over to you, Jason, and to you, Greg, and to everyone. Please enjoy. And if we have time, of course, we'll do Q&A. And Jason, Greg, and everyone, welcome.
Thank you, Gloria.
Thank you very much. So, I think what Greg and I kind of had in mind is since we're sort of approaching this from kind of two different sides, myself more as a designer and web person, and Greg more from the side of actually designing the letter forms themselves, and then kind of working towards the middle where we both do a lot of graphic design work. I've got a little set of slides to go through and a bunch of examples to look at, and then Greg's going to take over, and we'll kind of try and do a little bit of back and forth in the middle to kind of connect those two sides of these disciplines in the middle, and hopefully this will all be entertaining for everyone. All right, so hopefully this is coming through all right. The whole goal with this is to not just introduce the idea of variable fonts, but connect them with how we think about what type and typography is and how we teach that to people who are both new to studying typography, but people who are thinking about how they're going to design typefaces, and then carrying that forward to how we might apply it in different mediums. So as Gloria said, I think of myself really as a tinkerer first, leading to a lot of design and web development and typography work. I've been focused in on web typography for about 10 years. I've been working on the web for about 25. And so I've kind of seen all the different ways that we can go about getting text on screen. And this particular development of variable fonts is one that I think is the most profound evolution since I've gotten into this industry. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about why I think so. So covering the basics, a variable font, if you have not heard of them before, is the idea of one single file acting as many. So instead of having all of these different widths and weights in separate files that we have to install, we can actually have them all in a single file, one or maybe two, and have all of those different axes of variation contained in that one file, and therefore accessible to us when we're designing. So that first hurdle that we get through when we're teaching somebody about type comes after you explain to them what a typeface is. The next thing they have to do is decide which of these variations do I want to use in this project. And so we can remove that hurdle simply by explaining this is the entirety of that typeface in this one file. Now you can go explore. And as the applications get better and better, since its introduction, then we're able to do that in a much more fluid manner. A lot of what you're seeing today is actually shown, well, everything in my slides is actually in the browser. So this is all actual web fonts and all just basic HTML and CSS. That's the first place where we could really put them to good use. Application support is coming along in other ways for other platforms. CorelDRAW, Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, Sketch, they all support variable fonts to their relatively to their fullest extent. And even Windows 10 and Mac OS at the operating system level will allow you to use a variable font, but only with the presets that the type designer has put in, similar to the standard instances of regular, bold, narrow, condensed, etc. So, so that's the basics of it. What do we mean by all of these different axes of variation? Well, I thought I would employ my loyal and trusty assistants. That's Tristan on the left and Tilly on the right, and sort of show you some examples of what a width axis might do. So that's, again, it's all one typeface that we're using to show this. Might have a weight axis. You could even have an X height axis. So all of these things could be contained in a single font file, and it might even have slant. And one of the interesting things about this is we have these 5 registered axes of width, weight, slant, italic, and they're separate. So we can use those independently depending on what the typeface designer has enabled, and optical size. So italics is really what you would imagine. It's either upright or italic. Usually that comes with glyph substitutions and a jump from an upright to whatever angle they've chosen. Slant allows you to go anywhere in between. So the idea of a slant axis, most often seen with sans serif typeface, would allow you to pick any degree angle and animate it if you want, just like we saw on the last slide. Now, optical size is the 5th of these sort of registered axes. Excuse me. The registered axes that were part of the original launch. And I'm realizing I skipped a little bit of the history there. This evolution of the OpenType specification came out in September of 2016, which actually I think is when I might have met Gloria in person for the first time. It was in Warsaw, Poland at ATypI. And when this was introduced, the first place they could show it was in a web browser. And so that's really where the support has come from initially for us to be able to make use of this. And over that period of time, support has gotten better and better. And the idea of these standard axes that only go so far as the typeface designer envisioned. It's not inventing or interpolating a range that doesn't exist. It's only the axes are present that you can use with a given typeface. And then we can kind of go anywhere in between. So it's been about 3.5 years that we've had this format, and it's now starting to be used quite a bit on the web, and there are more and more instances of it in print. But optical size, and I'm going to go back and forth again so you can kind of watch more closely what happens. Optical size is something that actually originated about 400 years or so ago, maybe even more, in dealing with how is the shape of the letter form going to differ when it's printed at a physically smaller size versus a large one. Given the quality of type and paper and ink, when type was carved at 6-point, they would usually have less contrast. So it would hold together on cheap paper and coarse inks so that you would still maintain some legibility. And when it's set much larger, you could see, especially over here on the left, this is Literata from Type Together. I'll talk about that one a little bit more, where the optical size really shows a tremendous amount of contrast once it gets to that physically larger size where it can really show off. So having that come back, I mean, we lost this when we went to photo typesetting in the 70s, and they just took one outline and scaled it. And the same thing happened with digital type when we started to use digital fonts. Reintroducing that allows us to get a lot more out of that single typeface. Now, it's not always going to be appropriate, but it has a tremendous benefit when we want to make that type really readable on a small phone screen versus a large desktop. I'm projecting these slides to you, or transmitting them on a 27-inch monitor. So this is physically pretty big. I'm looking at these letters in front of me and they're almost 2 inches tall. But we want to make sure that that also reads just as well when it's on a phone screen. And so having these available to us when we're designing digitally is tremendously helpful. So again, you can see what's on the screen here is all set, except for the word axis in the top left corner. This is all set using Literata. So this was originally commissioned by Google to be used for their ebook reading platform. Veronica Burian and Jose Scaglione from Type Together designed this, and this is the third iteration of it that they just released within the last few months. And it's got a wonderful weight axis. It's a beautiful type text face that you can use for books. I'll show you that in a little bit. But then being able to have that contrast here and go from that sort of force the optical axis low to high, you can create a completely different feel and have a tremendous amount of contrast just within the way you're using that one typeface. It really opens up our vocabulary in really interesting ways. So we do have a couple of other examples of that I thought I would show you. This project I'll come back to a couple of times. I'm working on this in my newsletter, which I put out almost every week, about web typography. And I've been going through this series of typesetting Moby Dick and turning it into a better reading experience. And so here you can see again, the same typeface, Literata, used small and large with the optical size and weight axis coming in really handy. And then if we go and take a look at one of the chapters, you can see it yet again playing around with small caps and open type features. We've got regular and discretionary ligatures and different number styles that we're using in different places. All of those things are available to you on the web. If you know that they're there, they're actually pretty easy to work with. So pretty exciting to me, really opening up the ability to do much more refined typesetting on the web than we've ever really been able to do before. So how does that change how we think about design? And this is really a big question to me when we start to have such a shifting landscape or canvas upon which we're designing. How can it change the way we think about teaching it? One of those things is about proportion. So when about 10 years ago, when responsive design first came onto the scene on the web, it was the idea that now that we had these small screens that we were looking at information on, the proportion of the type really should change so that on a small screen, it still can maintain hierarchy, but the size difference between a heading and regular text doesn't need to be quite so exaggerated. And in this image, you can see a whale of a tail is set physically much larger on the larger screen, whereas on the phone, you might tailor it a little bit smaller and make sure that it doesn't wrap quite as awkwardly as it might otherwise do. We're starting to get away from being able to think about an explicit point scale, such as you might get from looking at Bringhurst's Elements of Typographic Style, to thinking more about proportion, because we don't know what the size of the screen will be. And some of the things I'll show you in some of these demos were even digital signage that was taking over a train station in Amsterdam, or Rotterdam, I'm sorry. But you don't know where this will end up. And so thinking in terms of a fixed point size relationship is really not going to work. So that's one shift in getting away and really thinking about how we convey information and hierarchy is thinking about the size relationships, not the specifics. So that's kind of the first thing I think that as teachers, we have to start to think a little bit differently about what we're recommending to our students. We might start with the idea of a heading is 3 times the size of body copy, but that right there usually gets translated to, well, it's 12-point copy and it's a 36-point header. We have to get away from those absolute specifics. We also need to think about the jobs that typography has to perform. And that's, again, something else that has greatly expanded. It's not just a book or an advertisement or something in broadcast, but we have to think about, again, devices, where people are looking at them. Is it a Kindle screen, which is a very different kind of screen than an iPad? One is a much more paper-like feel to it, another is highly reflective. So all of those things have to behave in different ways, and we have to think about what impacts the typography, or rather, how should the typography react when it's in that context? Something like a light and dark mode, we're going to take a look at that in a second. Those have different needs based on the inversion of that contrast. We also have the size of the device and the user needs. One of the things, if you've ever used a Kindle or an iPad to read, is that it makes the controls for the size of the text and the contrast and the spacing are often broad. So again, if you have older eyes like mine, you might need a little bit more contrast. You might need to bump up the size of the text a little bit. So again, our job as a typographer is to think through not just what the designer, even if we're the designer, not just what we had in mind or the designer had in mind, but under what circumstances will this be viewed and how flexible does it need to be? So again, we're thinking about relative proportion again, rather than absolute specifics. So a good example is with a light versus dark mode. That's built into pretty much every cell phone now. It's built into the Mac operating system, and I think in Windows now as well. So if people prefer to have something on a dark background versus a light one, that's great. But if you have exactly the same weight of text, when you reverse that contrast, it will appear bolder when it's light text on a dark background. And that's only made more exaggerated the higher quality of the screen. So this big block of text can become glaringly bright when you invert the contrast without addressing the weight or the grade of the text. So this is using a grade axis, which is something that was, well, the first I ever encountered it was actually Tobias Fair-Jones had come up with this notion to compensate for different kinds of inks and printing presses to end up with something that would look visually similar. The idea is to make very fine adjustments to the weight of the typeface without disturbing the overall metrics. And so a grade axis works exactly that way. You can lighten or thicken the strokes without changing the space that something occupies. And that works really well to make something look visually the same, where we are actually altering the characteristics of the typeface as we invert that contrast. So they're subtle things, but they really have a huge impact on the overall reading experience in that environment. So as long as we know that it's there, we know it can be supported. There's CSS that will allow us to do this all in a single system, and make sure that we preserve that that ability to present the best reading experience, no matter what that experience. And I was just noticing some of the comments and questions going by. Not a ton of typefaces have a grade axis, but what you can do is use the weight axis and letter spacing. And that's what I've done with the Moby Dick project that I'll show you, is to increase or decrease the weight subtly. And then if you're decreasing the weight, increase the letter spacing just a tiny bit to compensate for that. And when you have that set in light color on a dark background, it really helps keep those letter forms separate. They don't kind of bleed together, which is often one of the problems that you run into in that way of designing and presenting content. So one thing I'll also say is I've got tons of examples in here, and I'll be showing you some of them, but also on the last slide is a link to get back to these slides online with a ton of other resources. So don't worry about if I don't get to all of these. I'll give you a link at the end that you can save, and then all these slides are already up, and you can view them from anywhere, and then also access a ton of resources as well. So I thought I'd come back over to this Moby Dick project, and if I just flip my own system over into dark mode, you'll see all of this kind of work automatically, where everything kind of inverts itself. The only thing you can't really invert is the artwork, but you could actually overcome that depending on the form. So what happens here is the weight of the text is decreased slightly, and the letter spacing is increased a tiny fraction, 0.0025 m. And that's just enough. The browser actually can render that just well enough to separate those letter forms just a tiny bit. And this is something that really has to be done by feel. You've got to try it out, look at it on a few different devices. But just, again, the code is not terribly complex. You just need to know that it's an option so that you remember to try it. Let me flip this back here and we'll go back to taking a look at some of these other examples. So again, coming back to the reading experience, because that's one of the things that I've always spent a lot of time focused on is improving typography for reading, because on the web, that's the biggest proportion of what people see on websites is text, and that's largely what people are, unless it's cat gifs. Other than that, most people are there to read something. And so that tends to be where I focus. And I've spent a lot of time playing around with initial capitals. What can we do to style the first line? Here we're using open type featured small caps. So we're really using as many of the best typographic techniques as possible. There's a tiny bit of JavaScript in here to adjust the padding on the right of any paragraph so that you don't end up with an orphan. Little things like that really go a long way to improving the quality of that reading experience. And I went with an indent on the first line of the paragraph because it is intended to be long form reading rather than scanning. So we want to suit the purpose of what we're showcasing. Going again with a different style of website. So this is a website that I worked on with Google, for the Google Fonts team, in order to teach people about variable fonts and how to use them with the Google Fonts API. This one uses a different paragraph style because most of the time when you're reading for instruction on the web, people tend to scan. So rather than go with a long form reading style of typography, we go for more of a scannable kind of typography that will end up having a lot more visual markers and separators. So using headings and big quotation marks and getting a little fun with a, and who doesn't like a nice manicule every now and then? Good ways to kind of draw attention to things on the web in a more scannable way. So these are kind of two opposites. We have things that want to help you stay in the flow and things that are meant to pull you out of it. And those are concepts that actually, it was Nina Stosinger who had this wonderful quote that I wish I still had in my talks, but essentially what I took away from that was just reminding myself that there are these two sides of design and of typography where sometimes it's meant to keep you in the flow of something and sometimes it's meant to get your attention. And that's what we don't want to forget. Type can do both of those things. And when you have a variable font that allows you to use it in such different ways, like Literato with that optical size, axis, and weight, it really does expand upon our vocabulary as designers. And it really gives us a tremendous amount of range that we have to work with. I keep mentioning a couple of other things on here. This was another project that I did, well, this is a little more topical. This was something during the days after George Floyd's murder. I'm a middle-aged white guy. There's not a whole lot that I can contribute to the conversation about the race problems that we have other than amplify and try and educate myself. And learn. So one of the things I wanted to do was read more of Martin Luther King Jr.'s writing. And I couldn't find a version of this that I really wanted to read comfortably. So I tried to adapt. So I found the text and set it this way and put it on a site, and I tried to put all of the different things I could do to make this a better reading experience, and then make it all open source so anybody else can take this and do what they want with it, but they can also enjoy that reading experience as well. So small things, but to try and be less a part of the problem and try and be more a part of the solution. I hope you don't mind that interjection, but this was a meaningful thing to me to work on because the text itself was so resonating, and wanting it to be more available to people was really important. So so there's just small touches of the typography in here that I really enjoyed. I felt that it honored the author and the text. And if you're so interested, letterfromjail.com is where it lives. And then there's a bunch of other things about the project and ways to get involved. So that's the Letter from Jail project. Going in the other direction, again, trying to kind of cover both sides of this in thinking about how we can make use of variable fonts and think about design a little differently, is pushing boundaries in the other direction. So I showed you a little bit on the variablefonts.io site and Moby Dick, but this is another website that I worked on for a company here in the US that works on a lot of large-scale government websites. So they maintain most of healthcare.gov, a lot of the vets.gov website. It's a wonderful company, and they wanted to be able to showcase blog posts and have them stand out from that are really focused on their design team versus ones about technology. And I'm just going to scroll down here and open another blog post so you can see what the more standard design looks like. So it's really exactly what you'd expect. It's a big header, but it's usually pretty heavy, and then maybe a lead paragraph design, and so there's not a lot of differentiation here. And then here on this one, in the publishing process, they can add one class to that page and then fiddle with a couple lines of CSS, and they can create something that is much more interesting in editorial. This is all with a beta of Proxima Nova, which is going to be coming pretty soon from Mark Simonson as a variable font. But this allowed us to use the same typeface, the Proxima Nova, here and here with vastly different effect. So that was another place where I really enjoyed playing with that range. And this is a blog post on my own site. Again, simple bits of CSS to create more editorial feel. And it reflows pretty nicely too. So if we go and make the window smaller, it actually still holds up pretty nicely even on a phone. So it does give us a tremendous amount of flexibility. And again, this is all one typeface. This is Roslindale from David Jonathan Ross from his Font of the Month Club. And again, just with weight and optical size, we have a beautiful text face that holds up really well for long form reading, and a really elegant, very much on brand right now, this is on trend rather, high contrast serif typefaces are very in. So I'm happy to be on top of that one. Interesting note, the TV show The Politician actually is also using Roslindale in their credits and branding. So that was kind of neat. So these examples in editorial design show that we can really do a lot more on the web than just have standard header and back to body copy. It takes a little bit more effort, but one of the things that has held us back before is we used to have to load lots of different files. So now that we don't have to load lots of different files, we have one variable font that might give us a huge sort of vocal range in our design. We can get to building that into our content management system. And I think that's really key to unlocking our ability to design more on the web, not just create a template and just keep putting stuff up there. we always have to have this quote here. The rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated, said the print piece. We know there's still books. We know there are still great publications out there. Variable fonts can be just as much fun there. If you have a width axis, think about copy fitting, especially when you change languages. Being able to tailor a width axis in German to balance things out with English allows you to preserve the intent of your design without compromising readability. Because again, we're still working with what the type designer has intended. We're not distorting it. We're not doing a horizontal scale. We're actually just leveraging the design space that the typographer had in mind. There's also some really fun things that you can do with typefaces that have, I bet I didn't include that link. Well, maybe we'll come back to that. With ascenders and descenders. So if you really want to set that headline solid, being able to set it really closely and then tuck the descenders up just a tiny bit so you don't get those collisions. I mean, I put those in sort of purposely on the title slide because I liked that overlap, but generally speaking, you want to maintain a little bit of space, but being able to create the visual impact of that wall of text without having the collisions is pretty easy to do if you have that as an axis. There's also a new feature in InDesign called Liquid Layout that's intended to let you take a design that you worked on tabloid perhaps and then reformat it for A4 advertisement for a magazine. And it will scale all those elements, but imagine if that also allowed you to scale the axes of the type. So that's something that's not there yet, but all of these things about the optical size axis and width and weight, those are all at our disposal. So as you start to move these things around, being able to tweak the typography as we go will create a much more beautiful outcome. Motion graphics. I wish I could get a show of hands, but one of the things that my wife likes to do in the morning as we're getting ready is she likes to have the Today Show on. And I like the news, but I really can't stand the way they butcher type in the lower thirds. They scale and push and pull things all the time. If they actually had broadcast software that leveraged a width and weight axis in the variable fonts, they'd have much more elegant results. And actually, this is one of the things I wanted to show you that is all about putting text and type in motion. This is from Studio Dunbar. They are a fantastic studio in Amsterdam, I think. And they helped put together this motion design festival in the Rotterdam train station. And this is all in a variable font. And so this is just responding to the mouse. And then I'm just going to load up a little bit here so you can see some of the text there is all huge and all done with variable fonts. So that's what some of the potential is in motion design. Posters are on screens. They're not stable anymore, static rather. So we have the ability to design a poster that moves, and animating the type is going to be a massive part of that. So I definitely encourage you to check out demofestival.com. There's tons of videos here from other things going on that they had during that festival. And it's really, really worth exploring. So we can have much better scaling of type in the lower thirds. We can adjust for copy length. Think about credit sequence design. They're currently doing so many terrible things to letter forms in these broadcast, like After Effects and stuff like that. It's a lot of scaling and pushing and pulling, where if they were actually working with the actual axes of the typeface, it could be so much nicer. So there's a lot of growth here. This is probably one of the areas that's lagging the most in software. So part of the challenge over the last couple of years has been doing a lot of work with Adobe, with Monotype, with other software companies to help them understand the potential and the application of these things. So I do a lot of demos showcasing how we might use it in AR and VR, or how we might work with it in print. So there's this piece when Adidas back in about 2 years ago, they presented this work at ATypI in Antwerp, and they worked with Jeremy Mickle in LA to design these typefaces, and they have 2 variable fonts that they use as part of their brand and for uniform design and part of their advertising. And they do beautiful work with it in print. I took that and so like, what might we do on the web to put it in motion? And so again, this is all using that single core brand face here, and then getting into the one that they use, Adenoia Chop. So again, this is all animated in the browser, but you can get that feeling and that that fluidity that you get from much higher, I don't know, higher production effort in video, but we really can do an awful lot just by playing around with these in the browser. So as the software improves, we're going to have so many things that we can do with this. It's going to be really exciting. And for the moment, we get to play with it on the web, but being able to have access to this in software that's really intended for it will be really fantastic. And the web, it's where we get to do the most. It's certainly where I've gotten to work on it the most and put it in front of the biggest number of people, which has been pretty fantastic. So one of the challenges with using type on the web has always been performance. Every time you're looking at a web page, the web page doesn't show up until everything that's needed has been downloaded. And so you have to download the fonts, the JavaScript, the images, all of this other stuff. And the fonts are usually the first thing that people try to kick to the side. It's the last thing that came along. So engineering very often says, nope, we're not going to do that. We're only going to let you load 3 or whatever the answer might be. So our typographic voice has been very constrained. Because we can have a single 1 or 2 much more efficient files, we can actually download less data, render pages faster, and overcome these engineering concerns. And that will in turn open up the chances we have to design better. And so I just went through this with a company up in Halifax that works on the Bleacher Report Live website, which is a big sports broadcasting website here in the US. And what we ended up doing was auditing the typefaces they were using already, and 2 were available as variable fonts. And by replacing those, we had Objective from Dalton Mogg and Rubik, which was an open source typeface that I think Google has been supporting. And 2 files could replace 8 separate files. And we removed over 300K of data from the download and improved the render times on the page. So we addressed all of these problems that result in terabytes of data transfer every year. They get millions and millions of visitors over the course of the year to watch soccer, to watch or football, depending on where you're connecting from. But that was a clear win just on the performance side. The Nielsen Norman Group, which is renowned for their usability research, put a variable font in place on their website specifically because they were able to take away 80K of download and a few hundred milliseconds of render time, because they knew that that would improve their conversion. So these things have very real value when you put them in place on, for example, an e-commerce website. Stripe just relaunched their own rebrand, and they have a variable version of their typeface. They're all about conversion and e-commerce performance. So it really helps underscore that this is a major benefit for things on the technical side and the user experience, which will then in turn enable us to design things that are a lot more interesting. So another example there is Georgia.gov. I'm not sure if anybody here is connected from Georgia, but this is a project I've gotten to work on with the Georgia Gov Digital Services team for the last 2 years. And we designed the whole design system around using variable fonts and all of these things about scaling typography. And it's now in use on, I think, all 80 plus agency websites, which is really exciting. So 3.5 to 4 million people a week are seeing all of this stuff. and it's supporting all the old browsers just as well. So it's really interesting to see. Yeah, I just saw the comment about the governor of Georgia. I will not make any commentary about that. Their digital services team is phenomenal, and they're wonderful to work with. And the best thing is we do all this for the citizens of Georgia, and they're the ones who benefit from getting access to these services faster. So that's absolutely wonderful, regardless. So I think some of the last things that I wanted to show you were some more examples of what we can do with the same blog post and just changing a few lines of CSS, again, all using one typeface. So, oh, I forgot I had this open already. So coming over here, this is a fairly standard kind of layout. The images are a little bit big, but centered column of text, maybe a little bit of flair, but generally speaking, there's not that much that's so different about this, similar to a layout you might see on Medium or the New York Times. But we add a little bit more CSS, and we could do something kind of interesting where we have the images off to the side, and the images actually, using a little bit of math, will scale. Let me grab the browser window here. There we go. So you notice that the images will scale before the text does. So we preserve the reading experience the way we want it. We haven't really changed anything in the underlying text, but we've created a different experience for people in the way they're reading it. We can push it a little bit further. And remember, there's that duality of type to get your attention and type to make the reading experience smoother. This is all using Univer from Monotype, by the way, which has a wonderful width and weight and italic axis. So trying to take a play on the typography of Communication Arts Magazine, we haven't changed a single line of the underlying HTML. So think about having this in your WordPress blog and being able to choose a layout, 1, 2, or 3. And it's all going to be the same. Get some other sort of interesting typographic effects as we go. This time we've done the same kind of math trick to put the images on the left-hand side, and we're able to create a little bit more visual interest without having to rewrite it for every single post. Take it even further and allow things to break. So again, embracing this idea of challenging people a little bit. They'll still figure out that the title is Design is Communication, even if they have to pause for a moment, but that's actually kind of the point. And it's also one that scales really well. So it just keeps breaking a little bit differently, but it still preserves that effect. So again, by thinking about proportion instead of specifics, we're able to have an interesting lead paragraph style, pick up a color from the photos. We're actually using CSS columns, which will kind of reformat themselves as needed from 1, 2 to 3. You wouldn't want to do that with a ton of content, but if it's for a shorter article or for a section of an article, you could definitely put something like this in practice on the web. It's supported everywhere, and have your layout go from maybe 1 to 3 back to 1 again, and create something that's much more engaging for people to read. And the last one that I wanted to show you in this series of exploration was really fun, combining the technique that I showed you earlier from a couple of those other sites to create this shape around the text and create that interleaving style. And again, like the underlying HTML of this is kind of almost exactly the same. These last two had one extra containing element, but that's it. And so the idea that we can think through what is the structure of a layout. If you look at Vanity Fair and really look at it, they don't have one article layout. They have 6 to 8 that they use, and they have small variations between them. We never do that on the web because it's always been too hard. Now that the systems are getting better, we're able to, and yes, by the way, the text flows from one column to the next automatically. The CSS on the web has supported that for quite some time. And so if I bring this in, it's now reflown into 2 instead of 3, and we're able to let that adjust on its own. So the idea being, we think through these different layout options. The specific text may change, which will then change the size and scale relationships between these elements on screen. So they won't ever have to feel the same, but it will feel like you've got a lot more to work with once you have these layout options in place. And then with a little bit of code, you can fine-tune things to your heart's content. That is something that I didn't stop and say more explicitly. It is really important for design educators to realize that we can't just teach what we've known up till now. We need to think about the material in which students are going to be designing and working. We all know how 4-color printing works. And so there's an implicit understanding and frankly bias in the way we teach, and we have students print something out and stick it up on the wall. They just printed it with a 4-color printer. So that's there, it's unavoidable. It's just how we have to look at things. But HTML and CSS is the material of the web. And by us starting to understand that just a little bit, it will unlock our potential as designers and educators to help amplify that for the students that are coming after us. I was very fortunate that my job on campus when I was studying graphic design was making the school's first website. Then there were no editors, it was just a text editor, that's it. So not that I wanna be an old man and shake my fist at the sky, but I'm a better designer because I understand that material. I'm not saying I'm a great designer, I'm just a better one than I would be if I didn't, because I kind of have an understanding of those boundaries. We all know the limits of 4-color printing. It's why we embrace varnishes and overprinting and spot colors and all of these things, all those tricks that we learn to get the most out of a printed piece. By taking the same effort to start to embrace and learn a little bit of HTML, it will unlock doors for you and potential to see the possible. And it's the students who are going to take that when they go into the workforce. They've got to know these things because they're never going to work on just a print thing again. It's always going to be a blend of, there's this landing page, there's a branding piece, there's maybe an annual report if they're lucky, but there's always going to be a blend. And if they don't start to understand how they can take this design language and apply it in more than one place, come take another workshop. We'll get our hands dirty. We'll write code. Gloria, that's what our next version will be. We'll actually get people writing stuff. It's not so scary, I promise.
Okay, I'm going to be the first one in your workshop, Jason. Great.
I just to let you know, there are a few more tutorials and references here that gets into the more technical stuff. And I just wanted to get here this, and I'll put this in the chat as well. All of the slides and resources are here.
Great. Fascinating. I'm going to take your first. I'm going to take your next workshop. Maybe I'll hire you to do private. How's that?
Sure. Anytime.
We can share. We can share talents. How's that? I think we'll both.
I just want to get out there and print.
Okay. Greg.
Yeah. Can I share my screen?
You are now in charge.
Okay.
Thank you, Jason.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jason. All right. So thank you, Jason. So my background is from font design, and I teach font design here at ArtCenter. So as I look at this technology, I have to kind of break it down and think how I can orientate students to kind of, as I stated here, work with it, design for it, and ultimately embrace variable fonts. So in my opinion, the technology is the easy part, especially these days. The students are incredibly proficient. They've grown up and it's such a much more developed nature towards technology. But that's really not the issue. I feel strongly that it's getting an orientation, getting a footing. So before we turn the students loose, we need to emphasize the basic function that a font holds and dive a little deeper into the implied usage of all members within the type family. It's fundamental. In revisiting traditional models within typography, students will gain an understanding around the functional roles and efficiencies that inform variable fonts. With a solid footing, students will be able to work with, design for, and ultimately embrace the medium, and as they define the creative opportunities within it. The idea around variable is not a new term. It's always been in part of typography. So it's really easy to get overwhelmed or maybe out of control, so to speak, by seeing the robust and the dynamics of the technology, especially how Jason presented it, and maybe have a little bit of inkling and then go at it, and all of a sudden the car is off the rails and whatnot. So it's important that we kind of come back and revisit. There's also the assumption that, well, within teaching at institutions, that students have a pretty evolved sensibility around typography, the problem-solving aspects as well as the form-making aspects. So as they come to font design, and I'm not saying that font design is the way to go through it, I don't know if I stated this earlier, but I'm looking at this through the lens of font design, especially through education, but with the greater sense of the larger landscape within typography education as well. So as we do in font design, we start with the real basics. And the real basics are even more fundamental than, is it a serif, is it a sans serif? But we really look at what are the variables that define every typeface or every letter form. Variables around width, weight, contrast. So these are all static in this nature, but they're static because it's easier to understand. And at this stage, we immediately understand the functionality of what these variables hold. They learn this in earlier typography courses, but usually when they come to font design, they've had a few more. And it's good to come back and revisit this and ask themselves, what would be the purpose of a bold face? What would be the purpose of a compressed face? What does contrast do? What's entailed in a text font? All of these really essential decisions and considerations that need to be made in the beginning, regardless of what you're designing for, right? So we want to address these and get a good grip before moving forward into what we're doing. As part of that beginning stage, we also look back at what is the true essence of what it is we're doing. Why develop a font? Well, it's about communication at its heart. What are we ultimately tasked to do? We're there to enhance the reading experience by developing a system that's understood through its familiarity and memorable through its modulation. That's what essentially we're there to do, regardless of style, whatnot. Of course, we assign other criteria to what the font will do as we understand more of the specifics, but at the core, at the essence, this is it. So again, it's important that before we catapult forward into these new areas, that we just get a really good understanding and a good footing and orientation on what the main through line is. So moving forward, we think about this idea of the system. So again, what Jason presented is a system. It's an incredibly robust system. And as we can tell, that system is ever evolving, and it is, it's very robust. So how do we condition ourselves? And so again, revisiting that idea of a system. So the simplest system of all within the font is the connecting A through Z. What's involved with that? Well, this is where we see these variables come forward with width, weight, and contrast. Again, not thinking about style, but just thinking about these fundamental variables, parameters that every font is beholden to. And then as part of the system, we add on ideas around anatomy, balance, and so forth. So once we have a good understanding and a good grip of that linear system of character cohesion, we can then expand further and go vertical and start to now see how the variable weight can have an effect on the system by extending the system. Even though it's fixed, it's representational. It's not truly variable in the sense, but it represents a certain variability. And so now students can understand that within the system, there is a certain continuity that goes side to side through the character set, and now also vertically. And now they're starting to understand that a typeface is just not a single font, but it's this all-inclusive tool, a much more robust tool. And creating a much more enhanced, mature way of working and looking considerations with typography. And as we go even further, we can see now that if we were able to expand this model, so now we're getting even more into the realm of the true essence of modern variable fonts. And so understanding how if we can now expand the model maybe to have a z-axis or multiple z-axes, that we have this ability to control width, weight, and contrast, and everything in between. But now, going from just the singular horizontal view of a system, now vertical, now we're adding this depth to it. So walking students or whomever through this, they can start to really grasp and understand the essence that is there. So by preparing them for that and orientating for that and essentially walking them all the way through kind of the static steps of what that is, it's creating this understanding around these concepts that inform variable fonts. And with that understanding will enable them to work in this medium in an assured sense of problem solving. And also allowing them to embrace and expand the system that variable fonts represent. And students will be able to explore the creativity while maintaining continuity and communicative objectives within the system. So it's in my opinion, kind of taking baby steps, going along the way, making sure there's comprehension at all stages of the process of the learning experience, so that when they are set loose, and the technology is the easy part, and they know how to use and work within this, they are working in a manner where they have comprehension, they understand the intention, they understand, why things should be more condensed here, why things should be heavier weight, why the X height needs to increase, not just because, and with a good foundation on that, then they'll take it to the next level and be able to work within those creative opportunities that Jason had outlined nicely as well. So, some books that I find impactful, especially currently, All Roads Lead to Roman, ideas around expansion, anatomy of a typeface, how to create typefaces, The Stroke, and Theory of Type Design by Jared Unger. These are all, I think, Now, do they talk about variable type? Not necessarily directly, but again, the principles around it, the ideas around expansion, ideas around weight, width, contrast, issues like that. The teachings of the stroke precede all of this by decades, and now even more so, I find it such a relevant book to source, because it I don't know, it in kind of my kind of thick way, it helps me to understand the principles that even more kind of in an analog sense. So I'll also make these available. So
Greg, I just want to chime in, because Theory of Type Design, I think, is one of the best books I've read in a very long time. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that book is much more geared towards graphic designers understanding how to use type well, even more so than it is towards people who are designing the letter forms themselves. It is a fantastic read. I can't recommend that one highly enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the thing in teaching font design, all of these books. I mean, I actually like them because they not all of them, but like you said, with Theory of Type Design, it enters into the sensibilities of type through the doorway of graphic design. And I think, it's essentially with font design as well as, that idea of understanding what is it you're designing to or designing for. It's really easy to get caught up in, like I said, the technology is easy, especially working with programs like Lifts now. So you can work fast, you can work furious, and you can work uninformed. And you may get lucky and end up at a decent result, but it's not informed. It may not have the traction that it actually needs. And if one is just coming from it from kind of one view, just the infatuation of letter forms, which is nothing wrong, I think you're missing the bigger picture.
Yeah, I just think we can see the future coming, and there's going to have to be a blending between understanding type and understanding how to really use, I think variable types almost feel like right now we're in a candy store, in terms of,
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I think so. And honestly, I'll be straightforward. It's overwhelming. I mean, it's like, I'm familiar with Jason quite a bit, and I'm listening to his presentation. I'm like, he's the engine, I'm the caboose. I'm just trying to catch up, and I mean, so.
Well, but I think it's really important that we have that sort of through line, though. I'm very fortunate that I was there when they were introduced, and it caught my attention, and I've been really focused in on them like a laser for 3.5 years. It's all I've been speaking about at events, all I've been teaching. I work with the browser companies, I work with the type foundries, but there's a lot of people that still don't know they exist. And we have to create that learning pathway that goes from traditional design understanding and education or type design to why do you care? I mean, that was probably the most interesting response I got after my talk at TypeCon in Boston a couple of years ago. Was more than one type designer coming up to me after the event saying, "Thank you, this was the first time I understood why I should care about this." Because there's still plenty of type designers that aren't going to make variable fonts, and that's okay. But there's a need for them. There's the difference between multiple masters and TrueType GX, and now we have variable fonts. It's all similar ideas, but this is new. This has an application that we didn't have before. And so it's kind of understanding that continuum and deciding whether or not it matters to you and the work that you want to do. But I think we have to have that pathway of everybody getting into it and understanding and deciding where it fits in their own practice.
I think one of the issues too, and Greg and Jason, I mean, as a typographer and someone who You know, we teach type, and I think it's something we probably, if this is how type is going to be designed, where you're no longer going to have, you know, the traditional type families, it's all incorporated into a variable font. Teaching the basics of type is, there somehow has to be taught eventually from a variable font view. And instructors, I mean, there's, if you think about it, you have a whole cadre of teachers who need to understand how to design and teach typography with variable fonts. You still have the same terminology, as, you know, Greg has pointed out, but teaching it now, we have to go back. And I don't know, how are you dealing with this, Jason? And Greg, do you see this will become an issue too for current teachers who are teaching fundamentals of typography?
There were a few questions about where typography is taught, and I think, or where web typography is taught, and that's going to vary with every program. I was excited to find out that UMass Dartmouth, near me, has a dedicated web typography course that's part of their graphic design program, and Laura Frank is amazing. She's got, I think she may be the chair right now, but she's been involved in the program for a really long time. Probably one of the first people to write a book about typography on the web, and that's absolutely wonderful. But then you can go across the gamut and find people who are still not even recognizing that you can use fonts on the web, and so it really is sort of guided so much by the faculty themselves, what they're familiar with, and their level of comfort. When I taught a senior studio in graphic design a couple of years ago, I just had them start writing. We spent an entire studio class writing some CSS and writing a couple of basic web pages. It's just text. It's not so frightening. And when you can break it down that way and show people, like, here are the basics, it's not so different from English that you're not going to understand it once somebody gives you a basic grounding. And the freedom that it gives you as a designer to see, I can really do this. I don't need somebody else to do this for me. Maybe I can't make a huge, like, complex production website, but I can put a real font on the web, and I can start to think like a designer. And the variable font is what then lets us use whatever we want, because without it, then you're stuck, like, loading every single weight differently. And that's really overwhelming. So that's what the thing that I think is so fascinating to me about variable fonts is we can remove one of those biggest barriers to being expressive as a designer and a typographer by not having to make those technical choices about what files am I going to load.
So what do you think, and this is kind of interesting, Greg, you can talk to this. Someone had asked a question earlier, I think maybe you might have answered it already, Jason, about what will prevent variable fonts from going the way of multiple masters?
Well, I mean, in my opinion, I think there's more support. I think, as I recall, with multiple master in the early 90s, the culture, so to speak, had not caught up with it yet. And I think with the way that the way we get our information now, and just the way things are, I think it's just I don't think it's going to go away. Just like print's not going to go away. I think, you know, unfortunately, I don't have any really profound answers here, but I think, yeah,
I think it's really, it comes down to the web. Multiple masters and TrueType GX were really ahead of their time, and there wasn't an application for it that would demand it. You know, where we have this massive technical problem on the web of how much data am I downloading in order to render this page. To put this in context for a lot of people that don't work that much on the web, according to some pretty well known and accepted research. You've got 3 seconds to get a web page to render before you lose 50% of your audience. So if your business is selling something on the web, you're not going to risk losing half your sales because you want to load one more font. So if we can address that problem, deliver less font data to get greater font variety, there's a market fit for a technology. And so that's why I've pushed so hard at all the web design conferences to get people to start to use these things, because that's creating the demand. I mean, watching this play out in the type industry, a lot of people got burned by multiple masters. They invested a ton of time and money in creating them, and it went nowhere. Now we've got the web. That's the 800-pound giant that is pulling this into the market. Getting variable font support on the Google Fonts API, roughly 75% of all web fonts are served from Google's font platform. So having the availability of variable fonts there is only going to accelerate the cycle of adoption. So that's routinely every week, it's the most read article I have on Medium. It's one of the most trafficked pages on my website. Variablefonts.io gets tons of traffic.
Right.
People learning how to embrace that. So I think that's the big differentiator right now.
I've also noticed, and because Google is really, really supportive of the design of variable fonts, and I've noticed just in the last 6 months, the increase of what they've made available on Google Fonts in variable fonts now. It went from, I don't remember when all of a sudden they started the category, and now it's exploded. And that's absolutely a sign that it's being supported by industry. I would like to know if you can point out any kind of a printed piece that you can say that has been completely designed using a variable font.
Oh, almost anything that Adidas has done in the last 2 years. So any piece of advertising, look at the copy fitting, that's all variable fonts.
I can understand Adidas doing it, and I know Jeremy, and I know the work that he's done for it, but I'm just talking if has there been Moby Dick in print medium set in a variable font?
I don't think so. And that's actually, I was shameless name dropping. I'll apologize ahead of time, but I was in Berlin last fall for a conference and got to do a workshop at Eric Spiekerman's studio, and we talked about it quite a lot. And the potential is there, particularly with digital printing, to do that. But there haven't been a number of really high quality text faces. That's starting to change.
Right.
There's very much a chicken and egg kind of thing. There's still in the low hundreds of variable fonts, commercially or open source, available, and the pricing is still all over the map. But just addressing some of the questions, they work in every web browser that's shipping right now except IE11, and you can work around that. You can use them in all the major Creative Cloud applications, so it is possible to use them. The question is the right typeface available? And now that we're starting to see, like, Literata is open source and it's gorgeous. That's a great text face, and it supports tons of languages. But Type Together has loads of high quality typefaces they put out with a bunch of variable ones, and there are a slew of other foundries that are doing. Black Foundry also has a whole bunch of really great ones, and I'm totally drawing a blank, but there are so many that it's going to get there. And it's just a matter, the controls in print publication software, in design, it's not good enough.
No, I know that.
Probably why you're not seeing it in a lot of print stuff yet.
Right.
Adidas paid Kenneth Ormandy to write a plugin for them. Right. That's how they were able to work with them so effectively in InDesign. Right. And Adobe just hasn't come around yet to the need.
I agree. I didn't want to say it. I just wanted you to say it.
No,
Because
that's okay. And
missing.
I say these things out loud because I want it to get back to them.
Right.
And I know tons of people at Adobe. Trust me, Sam Burlow, Dan Radigan, Tim Brown, all the senior people in Adobe Type care about this, but that's a small fraction of Adobe at large. So when us commoners who are using their applications, unless we go and provide feedback
Right.
to Adobe, they don't know that paying customers are demanding this.
Right.
So again, like on the web, it was easy to create the demand. That's accelerating. It hasn't worked its way back around to print yet, which is frustrating, but we're starting to get enough traction on the web that I feel much more confident that it's really going to happen. It's taking a little time.
Right. I think the next thing I'd like to do for at the HMCT is I think we really have to expand on the workshops for teachers. You know,
I totally agree.
how not about designing with, but Greg and I think Jason, you'd be great partners, and then maybe other instructors who would develop for teachers. How do you shift? How do you shift, or how do you talk about the same terminology from your traditional foundation and basics of typography to applying the same foundations to variable fonts? I think it has to enter the dialogue much earlier, because right now, and we'll talk about it tomorrow, I mean this afternoon in transmedia typography, where it's extremely important. And Greg knows this because he works with a lot of students who are doing font design for their projects in our transmedia classes, where you're looking at print to experiential to web to projected. So the use of variable fonts as an instructor, it really has to come earlier. The instructor has to, I think, start the conversation in perhaps, and again, there is no source right now. How do you shift or incorporate from traditional foundations? If there are no more questions, this might be great. You might actually have a chance to grab something to eat before you go into the classroom breakout. I mean, usually we've been dashing with 5 minutes left. You can get something to eat or drink and then show up for your classroom. But I'm looking to see if I think we've answered most of the questions.
Well, there were a couple things. I'm just going through the Q&A panel. I think it's probably worth sort of mentioning a couple of these things. Creating typefaces, that's a pretty big discussion to see about the differences in work. However, I think most people who are learning typeface design and have been learning it in the last 5 to 7 years or so are probably already working in a way that is fairly compatible. Just the thinking around it, and Glyphs in particular, both Glyphs and FontLab support creating variable fonts. Glyphs support has been really good and is getting better and better and better all the time. So those are good places to look, especially with Glyphs has a great community site.
Right.
So tons of help available there. So far, nothing from Quark or Affinity about variable font support. Unfortunately, I don't have any contacts at either of them, so I don't. I just
and
don't
Google
know.
Google has a great support system. Well, now you're working with them on developing that.
Well, they do for use on the web. I was thinking more on like the font design, but they've supported a lot of the development of tools in Font Tools and others in how to work with variable fonts. So SAMSA is an open source tool for inspecting and working with variable fonts that the development of that was funded by Google Fonts. And that's being done by Lawrence Penny, who's the guy who created Axis Praxis, which was one of the first sites to play with variable fonts. So they're funding a lot of work that is either at the foundational level for creating things and building and engineering the fonts, and then they're commissioning lots of typefaces. They're supporting the development of them. They supported the development of variablefonts.io. And so they're doing a lot of work in that space as well.
And I hope, yeah, Greg?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of at, because of programs like Glyphs, you really do find your workflow kind of going in the line of variable fonts. It's like what Jason was mentioning is that, you know, current type design courses, programs, the idea of variability is not really a novelty. It's not even really an afterthought because the workflow is such is that you're working in that. And I actually want to go back to, I think maybe a little bit of earlier point that you had and kind of address is that, proposing about kind of understanding the traditional aspects of everything. That's not a term. You know, that's not meant to be a class. That's meant to be, let's get what we need from it and let's move forward. You know, right. Because it's also understanding the level of students now. I mean, like I said, they're much more proficient, and the idea isn't to like reel them back and tell them how it was in the old days. No, by no means. No, it's just like, I equate it just getting a good sense of the grammar so that when you're working in this, you're not illiterate. But then because of everything that they've been exposed to, they can quickly move forward. And I think understanding that and supporting that is what's really truly important, you know. Right. And in fact, you know, teaching to catch up with the students, so to speak. I mean, that kind of doesn't sound positive, right? But
that's what I was saying too. How do we teach up?
But I think any good teacher that's kind of the view they see, because it keeps you sharp. I mean, you gotta. Right. It also keeps it keeps teaching fun, you know, because. Thank God I'm not teaching the way I was 20 years ago. That'd be right for all of us. So,
oh no, I would never go back.
No, of course, no, never go back. And so, but I think that, so all the stuff that, like, you know, my thing was pretty like let's look back, you know, but okay, but with a sense of like get what you need and like move forward. We don't want to dwell by any means.
No.
I think that's
one last comment from each of you before we have to end.
Yeah, go ahead,
I have
Jason.
to be the moderator.
Yeah, certainly. That was my comment. Jason, I'll let you in.
Well, there was a question from Andrea about the historical considerations, and I think this is a good tie in with that. It was fascinating to see the work that Monotype was doing, trying to create variable versions of some of their classic faces, like Meta or Univers. Or there were a few others that they've released. It is a phenomenal amount of work to go back, and you end up having to redraw to bring it into the modern grammar, as Greg put it. And I think that's a really great way to think about it. They're going back and synthesizing and creating a design space that was not created at the same time. The question was about Bembo, which is a lovely typeface, but was not done all at the same time. There was no bold or so like that, those things got reintroduced, and then you have to synthesize it. Whereas anybody that's creating something now is probably already working in a way that design space exists. They may not have tidied up all the corners yet, but you're much closer. And so there's different kinds of work. There's a little more archaeology that has to happen in looking at an older typeface to ensure that you don't end up with a lot of awkward corners in that design space. But not every typeface will be made variable, nor should they, and that's fine. But I think what we'll find over time is that a smaller number of really good variable typefaces will enable a much broader vocabulary for us as designers. So we're like, I don't remember who it was that I read. Everybody's got like those 6 typefaces that they know.
Right.
You know, as a designer, like you grow up with them and they're sort of in your bones, and you just kind of, you know how to get everything out of them. You can get 10 times as much out of a variable font. So when you get good at them and you really dig into them and understand the space, I think that's where you're going to see some really exciting typography.
And this is what technology does. it changes what we use. And it's
Yeah.
been that way in type design from the very beginning. Not everything stays on the platform anymore with the change of technology. Some make it
Yeah.
and some fall to the wayside. And then if we happen to look back historically and we're able to revive the face within the new technology, that's fine. But we have to remember, type is designed for the technology currently used. And so not everyone's going to make it. I'm getting buzzed from my back people. So thank you again. And thank you everyone for attending. This has been, we can go on for hours, I'm sure. But, and again, Greg, Jason, I'll see you at noon in the classroom where I will be your student. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.